Well, for more on Syria, let's speak with Michael Stevens. He's a researcher with the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies, an independent think tank based in Qatar, and he joins us via broadband from Doha. Michael Stevens, thanks very much for your time this evening. With this vision coming out of Syria, with reports of shelling in Homs, in Idlib, Hama, where's the ceasefire at?
Well, it doesn't look like there's much of a ceasefire at all, does it? I mean, there have been numerous reports over the last 3 or 4 days of violations that have been taking place. And it's very clear, I think, that, Homs has been particularly suffering. There are reports of over 1 or 2 shells per minute being fired at the moment. The problem is with a ceasefire is trying to ascertain blame. Now, if the Syrian forces can prove that they are retaliating to FSA actions, then it's very difficult to ascertain a break in the ceasefire in terms of blaming the Assad regime. So it's very difficult in that respect, particularly, to be able to sit there and say there's been a break in the ceasefire, because in order to do that, we have to ascertain guilt. And if we can't do that, then I'm afraid this violence is going to continue.
Well, in terms of ascertaining any sort of guilt or to verify what the vision appears to show, what difference do you think the UN monitors will make in Syria?
Well, I think at the moment, the monitors have to, first of all, establish contact with both the rebel forces and the government forces. Now, in order to do that, that's going to take a little bit of time. So we're not going to see an immediate result emanating from the monitors being on the ground just yet. Now, the other thing, of course, is the diplomatic game that's swirling around the monitors. How much will they be able to see? How much will they be able to monitor? Will they be allowed to go into the most hard-hit areas of Homs, for example? Now, we know with the Arab League monitoring mission that did not happen before, and that there were simply areas that the monitors were not allowed to go into. If there's a repeat of that, then I'm afraid the monitors aren't going to be able to change very much. But if there's been a learning process, and we can see that the monitoring mission has an expanded remit, then there may be some chance further down the line to bring down some of this level of violence.
Michael, if the monitors somehow do get access and aren't facing the same constraints as the previous monitoring mission, and they report the ceasefire is indeed being broken, what is the Security Council likely to do? What should it do?
Well, I think here then we have a very interesting conundrum that comes up, because the Russians themselves have approved these monitors to be on the ground. Now, as we all know, Russia has been the biggest protector of Bashar al-Assad and his regime and the Syrian loyalist forces. Now, if there's a clear violation of the ceasefire on the Syrian loyalist side, then I think we have some very good ammunition to go back to the Security Council, hold the Russians to account and say, look, you approved this monitoring mission. Now they're telling us that the Assad forces are breaking the ceasefire. You must now then come with us, otherwise you are in violation of the Security Council resolution that you yourselves put on the table. So it puts the Russians in a very difficult position if they find violence.
More broadly, with both Russia and the Annan peace plan, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has come out accusing, quote, external forces of trying to undermine the Annan peace plan. What's he mean by that?
Well, I think, unfortunately, we've seen this across the Arab world for the last year of people blaming foreign and outside interference in terms of ruining whatever it is that their goals may be politically. I think we've seen it, numerous times, from Gaddafi blaming Al-Qaeda, and now, of course, you have, the Russians blaming outside interference. Why aren't they blaming the Iranians, for example, who have been interfering on the ground in Iran for a number of months now? This is simply a diplomatic tool that they're using to try and stymie some movement forward in the monitoring mission. So I wouldn't read too much into that, I'm afraid. It's really a bit of a diplomatic trick.
You've just looked back a little into the recent past, and many have been doing that in regard to Syria on the question of military intervention, saying, well, the West intervened in Libya, why aren't they doing it in Syria? And I read your piece on the Gulf Times website where you said, quote, overt military intervention from the West is not on the table, overt. What do you mean by overt in this context, and therefore are there other forms of military intervention that the West can employ here?
Well, I think it's important to note that there's simply not going to be a repeat of the action that was taken in Libya. We're not going to be seeing mass movements of aircraft, fast jets, helicopter gunships even, and boots on the ground from Western forces that we saw in Libya. The appetite is not there. The potential for a quagmire in which we frankly have forces that then could be involved in all sorts of problems that they don't fully understand in Syria is too high. So I think in terms of looking at the other options, which is not overt, now, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, for example, have been itching to send some kind of military assistance to the rebels. We don't know whether that extends to special forces from both those countries being on the ground, but certainly we could extend help to that direction. Now, at the moment we're providing logistical support. It's very clear that, for example, the West has been providing radios and communication equipment to the rebel forces. Now, this won't involve our own troops being on the ground, but if Saudi and Qatar are both willing to sort of take it up a notch if this monitoring mission fails, then I think some direct support in that line would sort of constitute not overt military support.
What sort of genie potentially is being let out of the bottle, though, in directly arming the rebels? I mean, does the West know who it is arming?
This is a very difficult question, actually, and it's something that, frankly, we've all been worried about for a while, which was that when Saudi Arabia took a very assertive stance, we suddenly began to notice that, well, you know, who could Saudi Arabia be supporting here? Would they be Salafis? Would they be radical Islamists? We need to be sure as to you know, where this help is going, which is why I think the argument for the West being involved in the process actually has some weight here, because if we're not involved in trying to identify elements of the rebel forces that we want to work with, these weapons could end up anywhere, with anybody, and they could be used in all sorts of sectarian strife that may afflict Syria in the coming months. So the fact is, frankly, we don't really know, and we've got to be a little bit careful here, which is why I think going a bit slower in terms of aiding the rebels militarily needs to be done, because we can't afford to make the same mistakes that we made, for example, in Afghanistan in the 80s, when Mujahideen units were being funded with all sorts of weaponry, and we know what happened there. So I think there's lessons to be learned, and we're very wary of those lessons.
So, Michael, at this point, in the West's eyes at least, what will look like resolution? Will it be the end of fighting or the removal of the Assad regime? Or both?
Well, in terms of the diplomatic position, it's pretty clear that we want Assad gone. I mean, William Hague has said that numerous times. Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, has said that numerous times. The French position has also been the same. So I think that, you know, Western states view this as I'm afraid, a regime change policy. End to fighting, well, that's the first step. The question is, of course, if you want to implement regime change, you've got to get it past Russia and China in the Security Council. That's going to be extremely difficult to do. But if the war drags on, then, you know, sort of natural element workings within Syria in terms of support for the Assad regime bleeding away may lead him to fall, you know, organically without us actually assisting. So I think the end game, first of all, we've got to try and bring this violence down. We've got to try and stop the killing. But let's not you know, beat around the bush here. That's not the end goal. The end goal of the West is to remove Bashar al-Assad from power.
And then what? What does a post-Assad Syria look like?
Well, again, this is a very, very difficult question. I mean, you know, here in Doha, the Syrian National Council come through almost every day, giving us, you know, ideas for what they would like the country to look like. We've seen many sort of draft constitutions. We've spoken to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, who have again presented us with all sorts of documentation as to what they might like the country to look like. It seems from my interactions, at least, that there will be some kind of constitution based on egalitarian civic identity without sectarian affiliation. Whether that could work in practice, I'm afraid I'm a little doubtful. But at the moment, that's what we're seeing. So, you know, we can't sort of guess what may materialize. You know, this war could go on for 18 months, in which case, you know, we need to have another conversation at that point. But at the moment, what we're seeing from the opposition is a genuine desire to bring all elements of Syria together. And as I said, whether it's workable or not is another question.